Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're taking on one of the most absolutely massive, high-stakes challenges in modern science and tech right now. We are trying to properly define cognition. For decades, we've been trying to figure out what cognition actually is, where it comes from, and, obviously the big one lately, whether we can build it into a machine. Look, this isn't just some dusty academic debate anymore. It is literally the central question of the AI era. If we want to understand how life operates, and if we ever actually want to achieve true artificial general intelligence, well, we need a hyper-precise map of what cognition actually controls. So let's dive right in.
Right out of the gate, we need to challenge a massive assumption. We almost always think of cognition as this sort of magical biological substance, right? Like it's something permanently locked inside the brain, produced exclusively by your neurons and synapses. We treat it like it's this glowing, intangible inner property of human intelligence. But what if it's not? What if cognition isn't identical to brains or mental states or even human-like verbal fluency? What if instead, cognition is actually a highly structured architecture that biological systems just happen to implement first? Because if that's the case, our entire approach to studying life and building artificial agents needs a radical rethink. All right, part one, the cognition trap, biology versus psychology. So to understand why this rethink is so absolutely crucial, we have to look at the trap we've been stuck in for over a century. The study of cognition has basically been caught in a total deadlock between two disciplines. You've got biology, which is fantastic at explaining the physical machinery, neural circuits, genetics, metabolic processes, but it kind of misses the overarching functional logic. And then on the other side, you have psychology, which relies on these vague, heavily human-centric abstractions like consciousness, beliefs, intentions. But try applying those abstractions to a plant or an insect or an AI, and the whole framework just completely falls apart. The 5-task model entirely steps around that deadlock. It defines cognition externally. In this model, cognition actually becomes visible as an architecture of control. Specifically, it's defined as the structured control over behavior change in relation to informational task domains. It doesn't start with vague placeholders. It starts with something we can physically observe, an organism changing its behavior because something in its environment literally forced that change to happen. Moving on to part two, anchors of behavior change. If we want to actually observe this invisible architecture of control, we need to look at why organisms act at all in the first place. Every single living system on Earth operates under strict, totally unyielding constraints. If an organism fails to manage these constraints, its lineage ends. It's really that simple. To grasp this, we have to separate goals from tasks. Goals are the constant background requirements of life: energy, safety, and reproduction. Let's just call them ESR for short. But ESR doesn't explain your moment-to-moment behavior. Think about a zebra calmly grazing on a savanna versus a zebra sprinting in total panic from a lion. In both scenarios, the zebra is serving the exact same ultimate goal, right? Maintaining safety and energy. But the task is entirely different. A task isn't just survive. A task is, do I keep eating this grass, or do I run for my life from that moving shape? Goals are constant. Tasks are situational problems triggered by specific informational events. And that brings us to the true external handle of cognition, the B1 to B2 transition. This is the exact time-locked moment an organism switches from one behavior to another. Imagine a bird just sitting on a branch. That's state B1. Suddenly, a shadow passes overhead, and the bird immediately dives into a bush. That's B2. Now, the bird wasn't physically pushed by the shadow, right? The shadow was a non-contact informational event that forced the bird to select a new viable continuation to maintain its safety. This B1 to B2 transition is the observable footprint of information use. It's the exact moment where cognition becomes empirically visible. Now, what's really fascinating here is how this totally redefines information. A leaf blowing in the wind or a rock rolling down a hill, they might be responding to physical forces, but that's for sure not cognition. Information isn't just physical contact, and it's definitely not just a digital signal pinging in a vacuum. Information becomes cognitive only when it participates in a behavior change under the constraints of energy, safety, and reproduction, in a situation where the organism actually had alternative choices. The environment generates the tasks, and cognition is simply the system's ability to select the right behavior response to those tasks.
All right, part three, the 5-task architecture.
So if cognition is the control of these situational tasks, you might be wondering, are these tasks just random? To answer this, researchers compiled an absolutely groundbreaking dataset analyzing the behavior change triggers across 1,530 different biological species, all the way from bacteria up to humans. And what they found was nothing short of astonishing. The informational situations that force behavior change aren't random at all. They form a highly structured, substrate-independent architecture. Let's walk through how this builds across 5 cumulative informational task domains. First up is binary environmental control. This is just reacting to local conditions, like a plant growing toward the light. Second is distal engagement control, tracking moving entities at a distance, like a predator chasing down prey. Third is perception shaping control, actively altering how another agent sees you. Think of a bird performing a highly specific mating dance. Fourth is group dynamics control, navigating really complex social structures and alliances. And finally, fifth is rule-guided formalized symbolic control, using abstract conventions, signs, and institutions, which is, of course, the absolute hallmark of human societies.
This brilliantly illustrates how the living world maps onto this architecture. Not every organism operates in every single domain. Simple organisms might only possess the architecture to handle tasks 1 and 2, just managing their immediate environment and tracking moving objects. Highly social animals like wolves or chimpanzees, they operate seamlessly across tasks 1 through 4, navigating all those complex group dynamics. But humans? Humans appear uniquely astonishing in our ability to inhabit all 5 domains. We layer formalized symbolic control, things like language, laws, mathematics, right over the top of the previous 4.
Think about what this actually means for a second. If a system wants to survive in an open-ended world, this isn't just some random menu of behaviors it can pick and choose from. It is a strict, cumulative scaffold. Across those 1,530 species, researchers found absolutely no stable skipping of tasks. You don't find an organism that can navigate complex group dynamics without also being able to track moving entities. It just doesn't happen. Later tasks fundamentally embed and reuse the earlier ones. It acts as a totally gated architecture. A system must master the foundational levels of informational control before it can ever advance to the higher one. Which brings us to part 4, the true test for AGI. This is where we hit an incredible pivot point. What does this deep biological framework have to do with the future of artificial general intelligence? Literally everything. Because if human-like cognition isn't some magical biological substance, but rather an observable architecture of task domain control, well, then this architecture can theoretically be detached from biology entirely and transferred to artificial agents. Let's draw a really sharp line here. Right now, a huge chunk of the tech world is busy building what we can playfully call the conference robot. It executes preset tasks, runs tightly scripted behaviors, and generates super impressive symbolic outputs. It looks amazing on a stage, right? But it is fundamentally, structurally rigid. The true goal of AGI is a context-sensitive artificial actor. We're talking about a serious, flexible agent that operates organically in a physical, open-ended world, evaluating its viable continuations when the environment changes, all without waiting around for a human prompter to define the task for it. So what are the actual functional criteria for this? A true cognitive artificial agent wouldn't just be some massive database doing incredibly fast text prediction. Actually, scratch that. It goes way beyond prediction. Not only must it independently recognize which of the 5 informational task domains is currently active, but it has to evaluate its viable options within that specific domain. It has to dynamically regulate its own behavior change, making that jump from B1 to B2, and it must do all of this while maintaining its own organizing viability constraints. The decisive test for AGI isn't just perfectly imitating human language, it's possessing this exact 5-task world model. And finally, part 5, architecture over imitation. This leaves us with a profound, really visionary realization about the future of technology. We've spent years kind of assuming that if we just scale up the data, pump up the parameter counts, and hit higher benchmark scores, AGI will just magically emerge as a byproduct. But the 5-task model shows us something completely different. Cognition is about architecture, not just imitation or scale. We absolutely can detach cognition from biology, but we can only do so if the underlying control architecture remains perfectly intact. This quote hits the nail on the head. AI cannot borrow the word cognition without building the architecture. You can build a system that writes gorgeous poetry or codes complex software by matching data patterns, but if it doesn't possess the foundational architecture to recognize an environmental state, track an independent entity, shape perception, and navigate social dynamics under actual survival constraints, it is completely missing the very structure of behavior change that defines cognition across all of life. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question to chew on. As we look at the absolute cutting edge of technology today, are we actually building systems equipped with the same five-task world model that organically organizes human cognition? Or are we just building incredibly sophisticated mimics? Cognition can be detached from biology, but only when the architecture is preserved. Without the architecture, we just have imitation. But with the architecture, well, we may truly be looking at the beginning of human-like AGI. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. It's a lot to process, but until next time, keep questioning the systems around you.